Ukrainians, Balts, Poles still wonder, are these oppositional Russians not imperialists too? And that could be you. You could be wondering, is my oppositional Russian friend still an imperialist? We'll be answering this, but that's a personal thing. We also need to answer the political version of that question. What is a Russian politics that we could look at and say, this Russian politics is not imperialist anymore? Think of how big Russia is. It's a land with 11 time zones. It covers an eighth of the habitable area of our planet. 17 million square kilometers. It's much bigger than the next biggest countries on Earth. This is Russia. That is Russia. That is also Russia. And that's the Soviet Union. Where are we going with this? Now there is a special Russian word, prostor, which means expanse, but with a positive connotation. As Russian cultural historian Andrei Zorin has pointed out, you can't have a bad prostor. What it really means is expanse with a sense of freedom, a marvelous liberatory expanse. The point is that these images of bigness as virtue can distort the way even oppositional Russians see their country's history and the history of countries which are Russia's neighbors. And before we look at how that works, we've got to put a really important distinction on the table. It's a distinction between having prejudice at the level of a belief and having prejudice at the level of an image. My colleague Miranda Fricker has been so clear about this that we're going to steal an example from her to illustrate this. Imagine that I'm a man who thinks that women make as good politicians as men, if not better. That's my belief. But in practice, when I'm presented with two powerful politicians, a male one and a female one, I always choose the male one because it feels to me that that one just has more gravitas. What's going on here is that my beliefs are intact, but my images are soaked with prejudice. Let's apply this to the oppositional Russians. An oppositional Russian may believe in the right of all peoples to self-determination, but their image of borderlessness and bigness as virtue may give them a saccharine picture of historical experiences of Russian expansion, which weren't saccharine for their victims. They might underestimate the imperialistic credentials of the Soviet project and fuzzily presume that Russian imperialism is a product of Mr. Putin's propaganda and will not need much reflection upon once Putin is gone. But to East Europeans, the Ukraine invasion in 2022 may remind them of Budapest 1956, when Soviet tanks rolled in to squash a national uprising, or 68, when Soviet tanks entered Prague, or 81, when folks who created the first free trade union in Eastern Europe were also met with tanks, Polish tanks, but ordered from Moscow. Not to speak of anti-imperialist claims of countries caught inside the Soviet Union. So, images of bigness as virtue may be skewing their worldview in an imperialist direction, even if they have no imperialist beliefs. So what do they do about it? Well, if I were to recover from a prejudice like this, I'd have to leverage my sound, non-imperialistic beliefs to challenge my distorted imperialistic images. So I might say, well, I believe in the right of all these people to self-determination, but you know what? I do have a bit of a kind of saccharine nostalgia about the vastness and marvelousness of the Soviet Union. And that, I think, clouds my judgment. And that makes me not see and hear this experience that other people had, you know? Now it's time for an interlude about the kind of imperialism that Russia is practicing in Ukraine. This is Chechnya, the first Chechen war in the mid-90s. Russia's imperialist attitude to Chechnya is properly colonial. It goes like this: the Chechens are not us, they are a different people, and we may need to civilize them. But that is not the Russian attitude in Ukraine. For the Kremlin and for the Z radicals, Ukrainians are Russians who have forgotten their Russian. They think that Ukraine and Ukrainians are epiphenomenal. They think they're Russians who have imprudently become an outpost of US colonialism and called that being Ukrainian. And will remind them, the Kremlin thinks, of who they really are by killing them. And we come back to diagnosing imperialism. We've diagnosed the first fault, oppositional Russians who are trying to not be imperialist but still are. But there is a second fault we need to diagnose, and it's even more important. And this is Russians who don't have any imperialistic beliefs or images, but still have a problem. And that's because they have left imperialism behind but haven't replaced it with anything else. They've come out of imperialism, but on the way out of it, they've tripped or got stuck. And I've got to say, many oppositional Russians are stuck with this fault. So let's look at what the problem with it is. You don't transcend imperialism by leaving it behind. You transcend imperialism by replacing it with a new vision of the world and you and your country in it. Oppositional Russians in this category typically give one of two answers to the question, what is Russia's future? A bad answer and a very bad answer. The very bad answer is Russia's future is not Putin. The bad but not very bad answer is Russia's future is not Putin and a political system with real elections, real courts, free media and other democratic institutions. And you might say, well, that sounds perfect. What is wrong with that? To see what's wrong with it, we need to zoom into the answer a bit more and look at the way it's typically articulated by some oppositional Russians. We want a normal life, like in civilized countries. And we want to be with the civilized world against this awful war. Now, let's slow this down even more. We want to live in a normal country. We want Russia to be a normal country. This is actually an evasive answer, even though it looks for and normally gets a round of applause. So let's break this down. You want to live in a normal country. What normal country? In 1989, Francis Fukuyama argued that the world was tendentiously converging on a species-wide civilization expressed in a kind of democratic capitalism. This idea was wrong in 1989, and since then, most commentators have either given it up or allowed it to retreat into their subconscious. There is no normal society that Russia could converge on if only it got rid of Putin. There is no teleological pattern of history that Russians could turn to and say, yes, we'll sign up for that, please. Nor can you just label Western countries the civilized world and copy them. Western societies are themselves experiencing an historic crisis of trust in public institutions. Western societies are being pulled apart by economic flux. Western societies are being pulled apart by the divisive and disinhibiting shape of the internet. There's breakdown of citizen belonging, breakdown of truthful public discourse, and even breakdown of faith in the possibility of truthful public discourse. These are all challenges a modern democracy has to face. And if Russia is to become a democracy, it'll have to face them too. Let's make this really clear. Russians who passionately and agonizingly oppose the war and Putin, but say, we'll take a normal society, please, are succumbing to magical thinking and depoliticization. And the absurd terminus of this is when depoliticized oppositional Russians aspire to become honorary Ukrainians. These Russians say, all I care about is that Ukraine wins and regains all of its territory. That's it. These Russians are widely praised, but their behavior is actually kind of a failure of political responsibility. Oppositional Russians who have given up on practically engaging with Russia's political future and only support Ukraine are actually psychological siblings of that depoliticized blob in the middle, that 50% plus of the Russian population that has, with tragic consequences, outsourced its politics to the Kremlin. Now, to Ukrainians, these may look like the most admirable Russians, but this is an illusion. Ukrainians should demand from Russians real, concrete, constructive anti-imperialism. Let's put it like this. If your house is on fire because your neighbor has set it alight, it's no good leaning out of the window and declaring your right to freedom from fire. You need the fire put out, and you need whatever is going on in your neighbor's house dealt with, so this doesn't happen again. And that scream for freedom from fire is the equivalent of declaring a right to freedom from Russian imperialism, accompanied by dreams of a big blue ocean magically appearing in Russia's place. Wanting Russia to magically vanish is understandable, but it is a kind of complement to Russian imperialism in reverse, a substitute for the task of politicizing the ex-Soviet space and evicting the imperialist authoritarian model from Belarus and from Russia. Here is the deal. The real Russian anti-imperialist is not one who supports Ukraine. It's one who supports Ukraine and can also think about Russia's future openly. That means facing big questions about the post-Putin transition, about how to offer depoliticized Russians the perception that they have a choice about their future, about how to gain the trust of a majority of Russians. It means facing these questions instead of approaching them with your back to them while muttering cliches about Putin's evil and trying to outcompete everybody else about how anti-Putin you are. True Russian anti-imperialists battle not to win the moral high ground on Twitter, but to win political power in Russia after Putin. One thing this means is dealing with the 77 other imperialist myths we haven't touched upon in this video. The biggest of which is arguably Russia's myth about Crimea. And to understand how Russia's myth about Crimea came about under Catherine the Great, and how it makes losing Crimea for Putin existential, watch this video next.